What is the biblical basis of the doctrine of the image of God? The doctrine of the image of God is based on Genesis 1:26-27, Genesis 5:1-3, and Genesis 9:3 that state that God made human beings, both male and female, to the image and likeness of Him. The basic implication of this doctrine is that all human persons, regardless of gender, race, and capacities, are created according to the likeness or the image of God. Other texts in the Scriptures that are useful for this doctrine are Colossians 3:10, where Paul speaks of the renewed human being created after God's image. In 1 Corinthians 1:17, Paul asserts that in some respect the male is the image of God, while the female is the glory of the male. In 1 Corinthians 3:16, Paul asserts that the body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. Since the early Church, several Christian theologians have discussed this doctrine and have offered different answers to this question of what exactly constitutes the image of God. Without being restrictive, there are some major views to understand it. First, the structural view. This has been the dominant view throughout Christian history. Early Christian theologians such as Irenaeus, Augustine, and Aquinas held this view. This model argues that human beings have one or a series of properties which resemble God, which differentiate animals from humankind. For Irenaeus, the image was reason. For Augustine, it was the intellect or the will. For Aquinas, it was a person's rationality. It is important to note that during the early Church and the medieval period, theologians tended to make a difference between being created in the image of God versus being created in His likeness. Reformed theologians still associated the image of God with the intellect or reason, but they advanced the notion of the image of God further. Thus, Luther interpreted Genesis 1:26-27 as stating that both the image and the likeness of God is the same thing. For him, the image has a universal public dimension, where all humanity shares, versus a private dimension that represents the righteousness that the human being had in the creation. This righteousness is what it had been lost, and through Christ it will be restored. Although Calvin follows Luther in his understanding of the image of God, he does it only partially. Calvin rejects the public versus private dimension, but focuses on the corruption of the image and likeness of God. Calvin claims that this image and likeness will be completely restored in the believer's glorification, but in the meantime, Christians have been partially restored. Second, the relational view. One of the best representatives of this model is Karl Barth, and others from the Neo-Orthodoxy movement such as Brunner. Barth understands the image of God as the human ability to have a relationship with God. In his section about the image of God in his church dogmatics, Barth asserts that what the Genesis 1:26-27 refers is the relationship between God-humans and the relationship between humans. This has the implication that the purpose of the creation of humanity was that all persons, male and female, could live in fellowship. Third, the functional view. Perhaps this is the most known model in evangelical and biblical circles. It makes emphasis in what it says, Genesis 1:26-28, regarding the role of humans to fulfill the cultural mandate. Under this model, the role of ruling or having dominion over creation would be what makes the difference between humanity and animals. Human beings are then the representatives of God on earth and have the duty to fulfill God's command to subdue the earth and taking care of her. Of all the three views, the functional one is a more anthropological approach rather than theological. And fourth, the synthetical view. Some years before Karl Barth, Herman Bavinck publishes his Reformed Dogmatics in Dutch, where he offered a theological synthesis of the image of God. That is, an integrative view which interprets the image of God ontologically in both a broad and narrow sense. For Bavinck, the image of God is not located in a characteristic or property of the human person or one of their functions. Instead, he argues humanity as a whole, every human person, constitutes the image of God. The advantage of this theological synthesis is that it offers us a holistic approach, which can allow us to include the insights of the other major views, such as the structure of the human person, such as reason and capacities, as well as the functional and relational perspective.